History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of Oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spooktacular people. Welcome to this 571st episode of the History Goes Bump podcast. Ghost Tours for the Theater of the Mind. I am your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, we have a location in Montana that was suggested by our listener, Sara Jimison, and this is one of our favorite types of haunted locales. It's a prison.
All right. I was actually going to guess that.
This is the old Montana prison. And there's actually a new Montana prison that's right there in the same area. But, of course, this is the one that catches our attention.
Well, because it's haunted, right?
Of course. I mean, the other one might be haunted too, but it's more new. It was built back in the 70s, I believe. So before we get into talking about the history and hauntings of that, we want to welcome into the Spooktacular crew, Jay, Maria, Andrew, and Heather.
Thank you so much for joining our Facebook group.
And now, this moment in Oddity.
Sometimes you'll see a grom going goofy foot as they anchor grind. Maybe they're doing a pop shove-it, hand plant, or an alley-oop. But rarely do you see anyone skating as a blind person.
Look at you, Kelly, being all hip. You're like a hipster now.
I skated when I was a grom. These descriptive words are all skating terminology, as in skateboarding. When I was young, I used to skate on my pennyboard, eventually graduating to a real deck. As a kid, I even taught a couple of tricks to my neighbors. I recently came across the story of Justin Bishop. At just 8 years old, Justin was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa. This is a rare eye disease which typically causes the afflicted to go blind by middle age. Justin lost the majority of his eyesight at 25 and stopped skating while he concentrated on learning how to navigate a life which would be his new normal. But Justin Bishop is anything but normal. His passion drove him to get back on his deck, just 4 years after that. Justin skates with a cane. This additional sensory assist helps him feel the curve of a bowl or the width of a wall that he is grinding on. During an interview, Justin shared this about another item that assists him while he skates. Zappos kind of saw one of my videos using it, the it being a beeping box that helps him see an area with his ears. And they do a program with Not Impossible Labs. And they actually made something called a phased array speaker system. It's pretty much a beeper box on steroids, so I can actually change the direction of the sound. I can make a wall of sound. I can manipulate sound in all these crazy ways, so I've been using that a lot more to skate. Previously, Justin was skating by muscle memory. Today, he's a professionally sponsored skateboarder and is learning new tricks and gaining speed with confidence. This type of triumph that Justin Bishop has obtained takes perseverance and passion, and I don't know that it makes him odd, but he certainly is awesome.
Are you afraid of the dark?
And now this month in history.
In the month of January on the 2nd, in 1963, an incredibly large snowman was built in Aberdeen, Scotland. It all started during Britain's Big Freeze, which began on Boxing Day in 1962 and continued on for the following 3 months. Due to the amount of snowfall, school kids were enjoying a snow day. Siblings Roddy Stewart, age 16, brother Michael, 21, and sister Leslie, 18, decided to create something unexpected during their time away from school. Leslie's boyfriend David, now husband, assisted the siblings as well. A snowman is not unexpected. However, A 17-foot tall snowman is not something one sees every day. It took them less than a day to complete the towering chap, and the group topped him off with a straw basket hat, scarf, and a pipe. Not only did the frozen creation resemble a snowman, but it had sculpted shoulders, arms, hands, and legs. It was quite the endeavor that the young adults accomplished brilliantly. The snowman also caught the attention of the press, and articles were run in the local Evening Express and international newspapers. Even a 5-year-old girl in Florida saw the news about the snowman, and she wrote a letter which was sent to Aberdeen. It was simply addressed to Snowman Builder Roddy. Her letter read, "Dear Roddy, I thought you might be happy to see how far your talents have reached in this wonderful world of ours." Roddy responded to the young girl by writing her back and sending a copy of the Evening Express article along with 2 photos. The kid's fantastic feat is still noted today, and not for lack of attempt by others, but there has never been a taller snowman built in Aberdeen to date.
The Old Montana Prison is said to be the most haunted location in southwest Montana. This is a state prison that was used for over 100 years and was the first territorial prison in the western part of the United States. The prison closed in 1979 and has reopened as a venue with multiple museums, the main one being the prison itself. There were deaths here and a violent riot, and perhaps that's why the spirits walk the corridors and hide in the cells. Join us for the history and hauntings of the Old Montana Prison.
Deer Lodge is the second oldest town in Montana. We generally start these city histories, Kelly, with talking about the Native Americans or the indigenous groups that lived in a particular area. We can't really do that with this one because when it comes to Deer Lodge, there were no indigenous groups that lived here. They occasionally gathered for events like horse races, but that's about it.
Really?
Lewis and Clark were the first documented visitors to pass by the Deer Lodge Valley, and by 1846, the valley was part of the Oregon Territory. It moved to the Washington Territory and then the Idaho Territory before it finally was the Montana Territory in 1864. It had a bit of an identity crisis.
A little bit fickle.
Or maybe Montana just wanted to be a part of a whole bunch of states before it became its own state.
It could be.
Johnny Grant was the first settler here, and he raised cattle and horses. He encouraged others to join him, which wasn't hard to do when gold was found nearby. At the time, Deer Lodge was known as LaBarge City. In 1866, Conrad Coors bought Grant's holdings and he became a cattle king in Montana with over 50,000 head of cattle that grazed over 10 million acres.
It's a lot of cattle to rustle.
Kelly, what? Are you a cattle rustler now?
Or circle up to bring home or bring to slaughter or...
Uh-huh.
We have a show called Yellowstone. Forget about Yellowstone. Let's whatever the name of his ranch was. Holy cow. That property is now the Grant Coors Ranch National Historic Site. A territorial prison would be established at Deer Lodge in 1869.
This is a really cool looking prison. It looks like a red brick castle with lots of windows along the sides with turreted towers and iron gates. The property has several buildings, including the administration building, the general population cell blocks, the library, the death tower, the chapel, isolation cells, and maximum security. This all got started with a federal bill that put aside $40,000 for Montana Penitentiary. The local government picked C.S. Ream and William Sturgis to locate and fix a site for said penitentiary, and they chose a town called Argenta. The territorial government decided against the recommendation and ultimately chose Deer Lodge City, as it was called at the time. But as is the case so often with bureaucracy and funding, there wasn't enough money, and there were many delays before the cornerstone was finally laid on June 2, 1870. George McBurney and William Lenore were contracted to construct the new prison. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, Lenore died suddenly. McBurney continued without him. Convict labor was used to build the prison, and they laid 1.2 million bricks. Those bricks were quarried from a nearby area.
There was nothing fancy about this jail, and of course there really was nothing fancy about any jail, especially the ones they built back then. The first wing to be finished was described as, quote, nothing but bare stone walls, roof, floor, 14 brick cells, 6 by 8 feet in the clear with nothing between them and the roof, and only gratings for the lower windows. The outer sandstone walls stood 24 feet high with an additional 4 feet below the ground to prevent escape. And that wall is actually going to be added later. It wasn't added at this particular time. The prison officially opened and took in its first 9 convicts on July 2nd, 1871. William F. Wheeler was the U.S. Marshal for the Montana Territory, and he was placed in charge of the Montana prison. The first prisoner was Samuel E. Hughes, who committed an armed assault and was sentenced to a year in prison. In these first couple of years, the prison was under federal ownership, even though only one person was a federal prisoner. The rest were territorial prisoners. This seemed to be the case at many territorial prisons, and the U.S. Congress decided to transfer the penitentiaries to their respective territorial governments. The Montana prison had this happen on May 15, 1873, and there were 21 inmates incarcerated at that time.
A 3-member director's board with a warden was chosen as the best route to manage the prison. Those members were Hugh Duncan, J.H. Robertson, and Granville Stewart. C.B. Adriance became the warden. The board immediately petitioned for more cells to be built. Congress awarded the money, and the new cell block was described as, quote, the building is of stone, and its length is 80 and its width by 40 feet on the outside. The walls are 2 feet thick and 22 feet high. The mansard roof makes a story and gives room for a 3rd tier of cells. When the building was accepted, it had but 1 tier of 14 cells, built in the center of the ground floor. Since then, we've constructed a 2nd tier of cells, above the others at a cost of $6,000. Despite the new cells, the prison was still inadequate for the needs of the community. The Central Administration Building was constructed in 1884. This was made from stone and 50 feet long and housed the guards' sleeping quarters, warden's office, and a visitor's reception room.
In 1890, Frank Conley became the warden. As a teenager, he helped create Yellowstone National Park, and then later he joined the Central Montana Vigilance Committee. He became a deputy sheriff and was assigned the duty to transport criminals to the Montana State Prison. He liked it there and joined as a guard and worked his way up. Conley would be responsible for building the bulk of the structures here. He was the one who constructed the outer walls that still stand today. He built separate housing for female prisoners. Several cell blocks were added. Several hundred inmates could be housed after this. And he built the first ever prison theater.
Wait, what?
Yeah, they had a theater there on the property.
Wow.
I didn't get a whole lot of specifics about it, so I don't know if they put on productions for the entire city or if it was just for everybody in the prison. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
This would be the W.A. Clark Theater, which was named for Copper King William A. Clark, who donated $10,000 for the theater. Apparently, he was a personal friend of Conley's, so that's how the money got transferred there, I guess. The theater had leather seats and could seat 1,000 people. There were plays, concerts, prize fights, movies, and more.
Oh, my word.
So now I'm thinking it probably was for the community.
Yeah.
A fire broke out in the theater in 1975 and completely destroyed it. It was ruled arson. Conley became mayor of Deer Lodge eventually. He also became a corrupt man through the years and got very powerful. He was stripped of his role as warden but stayed mayor. He died in Deer Lodge in 1939. Fortunately, when somebody gets a little too big for their britches, sometimes goes to their head and then they start doing things they shouldn't be doing, and that's what he ended up doing.
Life in the prison was very regimented. Inmates did all the work when it came to construction, and they also made their own clothes, cooked, cut lumber, and performed all that is done for the prison and themselves.
And the interesting thing here is this is the male inmates. The female inmates weren't allowed to do anything. Which, I mean, you'd sit there and go, well, at least they didn't have to work hard, but how boring. There was absolutely nothing for them to do. You would think they would at least put them to work cooking and helping to make clothes or something.
I was going to say, at least making clothes.
Yeah.
If an inmate wanted to grow a mustache, he had to get permission from state authorities, and there were written guidelines they had to follow.
You had to have been required to shave then. How did they make you shave? It's kind of like making somebody eat. Would they go in and shave you if you didn't shave yourself? Or maybe they would throw them in the hole, because this prison, of course, like all of them, had that hole you didn't want to go into.
Potential escapees were issued shoes with concrete soles that weighed 20 pounds each.
I guess you can't run very fast in those.
Just go barefoot.
It's kind of ingenious, though. Yeah, I don't know how they would make them keep the shoes on, but
The interior was painted a drab gray, and there was a broad yellow stripe along the floor to define the prisoner's walkway. Solitary confinement cells had heavy metal doors that blocked out all light and sound. Two of the worst areas in the prison were nicknamed Siberia and the Hole. Siberia was an area that was freezing cold in the winter.
I would think that would be the entire prison, because clearly there wasn't any heat here, so...
Especially to you.
Yeah, now I'm thinking they had windows at some point, but I don't know.
Maximum security was known as the Black Box, and as many inmates died there as those who were executed.
Let's talk about some of the inmates. Charles Panzram served here from 1913 to 1915. He was an American serial killer, spree killer, mass murderer, rapist, child molester, arsonist, robber, thief, and burglar. Whew. Man,
grief. He hit them all.
And I can't believe he was only there for a couple of years. He confessed to having murdered 21 boys and men, only 5 of which could be corroborated. It is thought he may have killed upwards of 100 boys and men. Then we have Paul Turkey Pete Eitner. He resided in cell number 1. Eitner had been convicted of murder and sentenced to life in 1918. Kelly, how do you think he got his name, Turkey Pete?
He stole turkeys or killed turkeys?
That's a good guess. Oh, see, we need you. If we decide to go do and I don't know why we would ever be in Montana, but if we ever went there and did an investigation, we'd need you to do that outside of his cell and see if we get any reaction.
Would he try to kill me?
No, he wouldn't, because he loved the turkeys. He was in charge of the prison's turkey flock. Apparently they had one.
I was hoping that he didn't love them too much.
Oh,
based upon that prior person. Prior prisoner.
I don't know. I'm assuming he didn't, because Turkey Pete was a model prisoner who eventually, as they put it, lost his mind. It was more like he got dementia. So they had kind of an ingenious thing that they decided to do with him, which I thought was kind of cool for considering the time back then. You know, somebody who has dementia might be mistreated or something. They kind of went with it. The prison's website describes what happened with Turkey Pete next. Losing touch with reality, at one point he, quote-unquote, sold the entire flock for the sum of 25 cents per bird, beginning a new career as the prison entrepreneur.
Oh my.
Humoring his mental condition, inmates were allowed to print Eitner checks in the prison print shop, and he was permitted to purchase the prison and run it from his cell. So he ran the whole establishment, as far as he knew. He paid all prison expenses and paid the guards' salaries. And all of that, of course, is in, little quotations about what, paying and purchasing.
I love that, though.
Yeah, I thought that's very sweet. At age 89, Turkey Pete died in 1967 after 49 years behind bars, and I believe most of them were served right here at the Montana prison. At his death, cell number 1 was retired from use. Today you can see it. As I said, you could gobble outside of it if you'd like to, Kelly. And inside they have his pictures and all kinds of memorabilia and stuff. His was the only funeral ever held within the walls of the prison. So they loved him for sure.
One of the female inmates here was Mariel Murphy, who was one of the youngest persons ever sentenced to life in prison. She was 15 at the time. Murphy was an accomplice to her boyfriend, William Newman, who robbed a man named Gus Anderson outside of a bar.
Where did he get the name Gust? Was it windy when he was bored?
Perhaps. Murphy lured him outside, and her boyfriend hit him over the head. Anderson was taken to a hospital where he developed pneumonia and died a couple of days later.
Oops.
Murphy and Newman were charged with first-degree murder. They were found guilty and would have been given the death penalty had the teens not claimed that Anderson had grabbed Mariel and Newman was defending her when he hit Anderson over the head.
Uh-huh. Sure.
The judge gave them life in prison instead. The judge really felt bad about giving the teens this sentence, and before they were led away, he said, "This sentence does not really mean what it says. You may apply to the executive department, and when the time comes, I will do all I can." Mariel and William only served 3 years before they were released on conditional paroles. They married and started a family.
Lucy Cornforth was another female inmate. She ended up here after very tragic circumstances. First, Lucy was deficient intellectually. A local sheep herder took advantage of her by asking her to deliver a note to the young daughter of her neighbors. The little girl's parents got the note from their daughter, and when they read it, they discovered it contained improper intentions. So apparently the sheep herder, and I don't want to know what he was doing with sheep out in the field because he clearly was some kind of a pedophile who sent a note to this little girl and The parents came to Lucy and threatened to ruin the lives of her and her daughter, Mary. Now, I don't know if they thought Lucy had written it or what. I don't know why they would threaten the two of them, but Lucy's response to this was that she decided to kill herself and her daughter, Mary. She went and bought some strychnine and poured it into a cup. Then she thought about it and decided that wasn't a good idea and put the cup aside. Mary had heard her mother talking about the poison and what she was going to do, and I don't know if Mary was a little bit deficient too. She grabbed the cup and drank the poison, and nobody knows why she made that decision. Lucy was arrested, and she pled not guilty, and then later pled guilty, and a judge was going to give her the death penalty until he realized that Lucy had mental deficiencies. 25 years later, in 1954, a retired teacher wrote the parole board asking that Lucy be considered for parole. It was decided she couldn't cope with the outside world. She was sent to the Warm Springs mental facility for several years after that. But she eventually was released, and she moved to Florida, where she died in 1966. So I don't know why they changed their minds and was like, she can't deal with the outside world, and then all of a sudden she can. And clearly she made a big move from Montana to Florida, so I don't know if she had family down here in Florida or what. And by the way, that psychiatric hospital is known as the Montana State Hospital. The nickname of it is Warm Springs, and it's still open today. It opened in 1877. So it's been open for nearly 150 years and was the first hospital of its kind in the state. This was one of those hospitals that embraced eugenics, and at least 256 people were forcibly sterilized from 1923 to 1954. Reports of abuse of patients have happened as recently as 2023. There are 2 cemeteries on the property, and it's thought that up to 5,000 people may be buried here. There are those that claim some restless spirits wander the cemeteries and the grounds. A ghost nurse haunts the main hospital. That's really all the information we have. We'll probably never do a show on it because since it's currently open, obviously you can't go and ghost hunt there, and they're not talking, so.
And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
Orlando Camillo Hanks was known as Charlie Jones or Deaf Charlie. He was an outlaw who was part of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. Many claim he was the toughest of the outlaws. He robbed trains and was finally caught in 1892 robbing the Northern Pacific train at Big Timber, Montana. He served 8 years in the Montana State Prison and was released on April 30th, 1901. Then he joined Butch Cassidy. He would come to his end in a saloon in San Antonio, Texas, when Pink Taylor, who was the local law, recognized him and pulled a gun. Shots were fired and Deaf Charlie fell dead.
And I don't know why they called him Deaf Charlie. I tried to find out what was the story behind that, so I guess he was probably hard of hearing. I don't know. Maybe he blew something up and made himself go deaf in an ear or something. I mean, it's possible back then. Little dynamite, wrong, push your ear that way.
That is possible.
Inmate Jerry Miles was the instigator of a riot at the prison in 1959, and this is a well-known historic riot there in Montana. The Montana prison was one of the worst in the country and was run with a con boss system. A con boss system is like a dictatorship among the inmates. One rises to the top and runs everything, and that everything is stuff like protection, goods, and illicit activities. The boss gets to the top with manipulation and sometimes physical strength, and he's usually part of a gang that he already runs, so he has the backup of his gang members. At the Montana State Prison, Jerry Miles was one of the con bosses. He had been in prison longer than he had been free, and he liked the hierarchy of the prison. He was a psychopath whom everyone called Little Hitler. Miles was ruthless in his domination, and he stalked young men for sexual favors. Another inmate named Lee Smart joined Miles in starting the riot. And it's thought that Miles and Smart were boyfriends. I don't know how willing Lee Smart was in all of that, but...
The governor of Montana had appointed all the wardens up until 1958. It was after the resignation of Warden Burrell in 1958 that the Montana Council on Corrections decided that they themselves would conduct a nationwide search. They believed it was time for a change. Floyd Powell was a man of reform who was from Wisconsin, and the council chose him as the next warden. Powell had 18 years of experience, and he brought along his friend Ted Roth to be his deputy warden. The two men committed themselves to abolishing the con boss system. They worked on getting rid of the black market in the prison and also getting rid of the drugs. Many guards were involved in the black market, and they cracked down on them, either firing them or retraining them. Food quality was improved, but a rule was implemented that inmates had to eat all that they took. Both guards and inmates were resistant to the changes, and con bosses weren't about to give up their power.
Into this steps Jerry Miles, who already had experience with starting big trouble in prisons. He organized a mutiny in a federal penitentiary in Georgia in 1944, which ended up with him being shipped off to Alcatraz. While there, he learned all about rioting from the Battle of Alcatraz. He had arrived at the Montana prison in June of 1958. It was April of 1959 that Miles instigated the riot with Lee Smart, and Smart brought on his buddy George Alton. The men had figured out that the inmate-to-guard ratio was at its lowest during the dinner time turnover. Alton had access to gasoline in the prison garage, so when the turnover started, he grabbed some and gave it to Smart. Miles made a torch out of a mop. They loitered near a guard named Gus Byers, who was on a catwalk in cell block 1, and surprised him by throwing gasoline on him and then lighting the torch with a match. Byers realized he was going to die if he didn't cooperate, and he gave up his keys and rifle. Smart and Miles then locked him up in the hole.
Other inmates ambushed the 2 other guards in cell block 1. Several of the inmates then went to cell block 2, where the ammunition was stored. They easily overtook that block as well. Within 30 minutes, the inmates had control of the whole facility except for the upper floor of the administration building and the minimum security housing. Deputy Warden Roth was oblivious to what was happening until Miles rushed into his office with a meat cleaver. Roth managed to fight him off, but then Smart came in with a rifle and hit Roth in the chest with a blast from it, killing the deputy warden instantly. The inmates forced another guard to call Warden Powell and tell him that there was a slight disturbance.
Yeah, just a little one.
Just a little bitty one.
You might want to come quickly, but there's not a whole lot going on.
The minute Powell entered the administration building, he was taken hostage. The warden was forced to call the governor, who was out of town, but he left a message that was a code the governor would understand and know that the warden had been compromised.
The warden was left with a prisoner whom he promised amnesty if he helped, and the inmate agreed and spread the word to the rest of the inmates. Several of them helped the warden escape. Miles and his crew of inmates were angry to find out the warden was gone, and they began building an escape tunnel, which was doomed from the beginning because the jail, as we'd said, it was specifically designed to prevent tunneling, so they weren't going to get underneath that wall. Warden Powell came back into the prison and negotiated with Miles, who said he wanted reporters to be brought in so they could see the conditions the prisoners lived under. As if that was really Miles' concern. The guy was a psychopath, he didn't care. The warden agreed, but he said nothing could be printed until all the hostages were freed, because at this point they've got pretty much every guard is being held as a hostage. By the next day, the riot was international news. 3 reporters came in and interviewed inmates, and they left without incident. But Miles was angry. He wanted lots of reporters, so he wouldn't agree to release hostages. Miles said he wouldn't release anyone until the story ran, and the warden refused to run it. This started a 24-hour standoff.
I wonder why they couldn't just print a handful of newspapers and bring them in and give them to Miles so he thought that it was printed.
Sure. I mean, it seems to me like it would have been very easy to fool him and make him think, oh yeah, it's all over the place now.
Miles kept shouting to reporters outside the jail, but the rest of the inmates were giving up because they knew escape was impossible. The Montana National Guard finally came in and broke up the riot. It had lasted 36 hours, with only Deputy Warden Roth dying on the police side, but several other guards were injured. Miles and Smart died via murder-suicide. The warden went through the entire prison with the National Guard and had all 438 inmates strip-searched, and their cells were emptied. Nearly 400 knives were confiscated, and several truckloads of contraband were hauled off to the dump.
Apparently the guards weren't doing a good job of making sure that, toss a cell here and there just to make sure that they don't have a bunch of weapons. The prison eventually became outdated, and the guards were horribly underpaid, so their morale there was pretty low. The facility finally shut down in 1979. Today, the Old Montana Prison hosts 5 unique museums that include the Old Montana Prison, Powell County Museum, Frontier Montana Museum, Yesterday's Playthings, and the Montana Auto Museum. It's closed during the winter. Visitors can do guided tours or self-guided tours, and there are also overnight ghost hunts. And there are ghost hunts because this is one of the most haunted locations in Montana. People claim to have been scratched. Disembodied footsteps are heard. Paranormal investigators have found that they get some of the best responses when it comes to responsive knocking. Investigators will knock out a pattern and ask for it to be replicated, or they might ask for knocks as replies to questions. The general public usually doesn't have access to the Death Tower, which is technically the Northwest Tower, and I think that's where the two inmates, Smart and Miles, did the murder-suicide thing, and that's why they call it the Death Tower. But on ghost hunts, you do get to go to that area. Guided ghost hunts also get to investigate the administration building, maximum security, general population, and the auditorium. And I believe you can also rent it out to do your own private investigations as well.
Ghost Adventures investigated during season 11. They caught an interesting orb coming down directly from the noose in the gallows, and also the sounds of a loud trapdoor noise and disembodied footsteps. The obelisk came up with the words Tom, Woods, Shoot, Self, and Weapon. They had equipment issues, and the batteries in one of the cameras even started fizzling acid. They felt cold spots and captured a figure on the SLS camera going up and down the stairs in the gallows and moving its arm on command. They also caught a figure using the digital still camera outside in the yard.
So Ryan and Shane used to do the BuzzFeed Unexplained podcast or show on YouTube. And of course, BuzzFeed went away, but they decided they wanted to continue doing what they were doing. So now their thing is called Ghost Files. Okay, so I watched that this morning while I was writing these notes, and I will never, ever understand why these particular investigators that make these videos are as popular as they are. They get like 3 million views or more, and it's completely disrespectful. I would never believe any of the evidence that they capture, and I have no patience for it. These people clearly did not check out the history. So they visited the prison in October of 2023. They set up cameras and recorders in various areas, one of which was the 1912 cell block where apparently a cannibalistic Satan worshiper was housed. I was like, oh, wow, okay. I went through and looked at all these notable inmates and stuff, and I didn't come up with a cannibalistic Satan worshiper. Now, when I went in and tried to look that up, there was a cannibalistic Satan worshiper, I guess there's more than one, that actually was at the new prison. And he died of a heart attack, I think in the 90s, 1993 or something. So he wasn't even in this old prison. He was at the new prison. Apparently, the show here claims that this was Stanley Dean Baker, who murdered, dismembered, and partially ate James Slosher in Montana. This was a real guy. He apparently was really a cannibal because he cut the guy's heart out and ate it, and then he had some of his fingers in his pocket.
Oh, good grief.
And he had an accomplice with him who also had bones from a finger in his pocket. And it was said that Stanley Dean Baker, when he had been arrested and thrown in a jail in Montana, wouldn't talk to the guards unless he had chicken bones, because he would use that to, I don't know, have Satan answer whatever he wanted to answer. So I'm like, wow, you would think if this guy was in this prison, they would have had something on the official prison site about it. So I must have read, I don't know how many things about this piece of crap Stanley Dean Baker, who thankfully is no longer on the planet and died of cancer. If anybody deserved cancer, it would be him. And all I could find was that he was at Park County Jail, which has nothing to do with Deer Lodge. Deer Lodge is not in Park County. Everything I looked up about Baker, I couldn't find like the specific name of the jail. I could just find that it was a Park County jail, or maybe that's what it was called, Park County Jail. But there was nothing that indicated that he was at this old Montana prison. So anyway, they spent quite a bit of time on this particular episode going to the cell that was Stanley Dean Baker, and they didn't get any evidence. And you know why? Because the guy wasn't really there. And they were like going in and say, hey, we love Satan too. Hey, we don't mind the devil. How you want to come hang with us? And I'm just like, oh boy, I really don't think that's really smart going into a prison to be talking that way. But anyway, a little bit further in, when Ryan and Shane asked how long someone had worked there or lived there, the obelisk responded 8. So I don't know if that meant like 8 years, or if they had been in prison for 8 years, or maybe it had nothing to do with the question. They also played videos from people who had gotten evidence doing investigations, and this one group had gone in there, and do you know what a kind of song thing that's like a shave and a haircut?
Sixpence?
Yeah, I think you're more accurate with it.
Sixpence?
Yes. So you do da-da-da-da-da. So what they were doing is they were doing the da-da-da-da-da, and then they got 2 really distinct claps, boom, boom. Ryan and Shane tried to do the same thing, and they just clowned around about the whole thing. So if I was a spirit, I wouldn't have responded either. They got no responses. Nothing clapped for them. Nothing stomped for them. They set up a flashlight in one of the former women's cells, who they said was named Nancy, and when they asked for it to be turned on, it was turned on. They asked for it to be turned off, and it didn't get turned off, but then they said, well, maybe we should say it like a guard would say it, and so they said, lights off, and they both yelled that, and then the flashlight did turn off. But there were also probably 5 minutes of doing the flashlight thing, and those were the only two things that pertained to anything that they were actually saying. So maybe that was actually responding to them, but then the rest of the time the flashlight wasn't doing anything, which to me, like, if you're really getting responses with the flashlight, I feel like it should be like it was for us at the squirrel cage, where it was like that flashlight was on and off every time we asked.
Yeah,
we were
pretty immediate.
clearly communicating with something. So I don't know how true that was, and I'm not sure who Nancy was. The guys asked if anybody was with them when they were in a cell, and they captured an EVP of a low whispered yes. There was another investigator on a separate investigation who claimed that he got scratched. This was on his neck. And then another group of investigators actually heard an audible female voice say hi to them. So anyway, I know we have listeners that probably adore both of those gentlemen and their new show now and that kind of thing, but I was totally unimpressed by it, and I was like, basically make a farce of ghost hunting.
Ghost Lab investigated during its second season, and Barry Kling said this was his favorite episode from that season. An investigator told the Blaze Rock Station in 2021, I experienced tables and chairs moving inside cells, as well as disembodied whistles in the main cell block. A group investigating in 2017 asked the spirit box for a name and got Jerry. They also captured 3 unexplained knocks. When a flashlight started flickering and an investigator asked if someone was messing with the light, they caught a voice saying, that was me. There were also disembodied footsteps recorded. They also captured a whispered, no, and a male voice mumbling. And a maximum security cell opened and an investigator yelled, that was me. This was followed by a cell slamming shut and the investigator yelled, that was not me.
It was so funny watching that part of the video because you could hear him off in the distance from the guy who actually had the video that recorded everything. And so you hear this cell door kind of opening up and making the eeeeep, and you could hear him going, what was that? And then his buddy was like, it was me, no big deal. And then all of a sudden you hear a slam and he's like, that wasn't me. The Spokane Paranormal Society investigated in October of 2018. The Montana Right Now website wrote the story about the visit. A woman named Heather Gregory is a docent at the jail, and she gave the group a guided tour before they investigated. She said, at nighttime, you'll feel like you're being watched and turn around and get that glimmer. I don't know what she was referring to, but I was like, ooh, what's glimmer when you're investigating? During the tour, the group heard unexplained sounds, and one member was scratched on his shoulder. So clearly, scratching is a thing that happens here. And this was by something as he descended the stairs from one of the towers at the prison. He said, it hit me as I was going down the last part of the stairs. The group detected the smell of sulfur, and a couple members felt nauseous. One of them was their medium, Sara Jimison. She said, I pick up on the negativity of this place, but it's a prison. Anyone would think it would be negative. I do believe there's good here as well. During the investigation, they captured a couple of shadow figures on GoPros and noises on their recorders. An article on the Visit Southwest Montana website shares about a ghost hunting experience at the jail. It wasn't until we were exploring the prison alone that I truly felt an unexplainable presence. The first such experience took place in the prison yard in the canteen. We entered the area, placed a simple cat toy on the ground between us, and turned on a highly sensitive microphone. While I could hear nothing, someone mentioned hearing footsteps entering the room. We were, of course, alone, and no one joined us. While the cat toy had remained unmoved up to this point, even with a couple strong gusts of wind, we asked the spirits to make the toy light up if they were there, and promptly, without question, the ball lit up. As the flickering stopped, we proceeded saying that if they wanted to communicate again, move the toy and make it light up. Again, the toy flashed on. We're going to ask you some questions. Light up the toy if you understand. Instant lights. And this is what I was explaining about the flashlight, because then you know you're communicating with something. If the answer to the question is yes, please light up the ball. Does that make sense? Again, the ball lit up. We carried on a conversation and eventually asked, do you like visitors at the prison? Yes. Do you want us to stay? Nothing. Would you prefer if we left? Yes. Guess they got their answer there for sure. We quietly thanked the spirits for their time and exited back to the prison yard. Having been on edge all night, a sense of calm washed over me following this experience, as if reassured that the spirits themselves enjoyed our company, at least for a little while, because they did want you to get lost. But I thought that was really cool, especially with a cat toy and the fact that the wind wasn't making it move at all. So
Yeah, definitely. The old Montana prison has a long history. Like so many other historic jails, this one has its share of ghost stories. Is the old Montana prison haunted?
that is for you to decide. Well, for anybody who's up north there and doesn't mind being cold,
We can go in the summer.
yeah, I mean, that would be the only time I could ever see myself in Montana, although I don't know that I would ever go to Montana. It looks like a beautiful state, but there's so many other places I want to see. Now, again, if we end up, getting a camper and running around and going to a lot of places, then I do want to hit like all the states and that kind of thing.
Most definitely.
It's just one of our favorite things, these prisons, and they always seem to have a really interesting energy there. We'd love to have you guys check out our website at historygoesbump.com, and if you'd like to send us some feedback, you can do that at historygoesbump@gmail.com. I want to thank you for joining us on this episode. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This episode is brought to you by our executive producers.
Join me in the cemetery by becoming an executive producer. You can join on Patreon or PayPal. Check out the Support the Show tab on the website for more information.
Join us for the history and hauntings of the Old Montana.
Bought Grant's holdings and he became a cattle king in Montana.
You're doing Montana like I do. Montana.
Montana! It's Montana!
This all got started with a federal bill that put aside $40,000 for Montana penitentiary.
Say it with me. Penitentiary.
Penitentiary. It shouldn't have an I in there.
Okay, I'll make sure to contact the word scribes, whoever makes up these words, and tell them you need to respell that.
Murphy lured him outside and her boyfriend hit him over the head.
Hit him over the head. It was the head.